Well, welcome everyone to our week 4 video. This week in the course, we focus on systems theory. So another school of thought in the development of public organization theory. In focusing on systems theory, what I really do want to present to you is I want to present to you an idea known as natural or closed systems theory. Then we'll talk about what we call the middle range theories from an author by the name of Merton. And then we're going to finish up talking about open systems theory from authors such as Katz and Kahn. But just more generally, to start this video, we're going to talk about what systems theory is. Systems theory is a way in which we can view and study our organizations from a very holistic perspective. So we're using a holistic perspective with natural or closed systems theory because we are looking at the entire organization. So again, kind of this macro level approach to studying an organization. So we look at the entire organization. In open systems theory, we again take a holistic view, but our holistic view goes beyond the walls of the organization and include the external environment as well. So we can really look at the relationship between the organization and the external environment that that organization operates within. Both closed systems as well as open systems theory both take a very rational type of perspective in that they view the organization as an instrument for achieving goals. And so at the end of the day, we are still looking at the ability of the organization to achieve its goals and its objectives. In natural systems theory, natural systems theorists will look at organizations as being very similar to living organisms. And just like any other living organism, organizations will attempt to try and survive. Their ultimate goal will be organizational survival. So just like an animal or a human being, the ultimate goal is to survive into the future. In order to survive, you need to adapt to your environment in order to be successful. The primary view with natural systems theory is a view inside the organization to see how well all the different parts of the organization are working together to achieve the ultimate organizational goal, which is, of course, again, agency survival. In open systems theory, there are a lot of similarities between the two, but the primary difference in open systems theory is that in open systems theory, we really start to look at the relationship between the organization and its environment. And that relationship is a two-way street. And then in open systems theory, we look at how does the organization affect its environment, and we look at how changes in the environment will then also affect the organization. So again, the big difference here is natural systems theory is a closed environment in that we are looking within the organization to try and achieve a balance between all the different working parts within the organization. Open systems theory, we look beyond the walls of the organization, and we're looking for a balance between the organization and the external environment that that organization operates within. Some of the underlying assumptions that underpin both a closed natural systems approach and an open systems approach is an assumption that systems do not have a concrete existence. Now, this is a departure from what we talked about with our classical school of organization theory. The classical school of organization theory was a very static type of an approach, where we could say we could develop this one best way to structure the organization, or the one best way to structure work, and apply that across the board in all of our organizations and in all situations, because it was a static approach. Here in the world of systems theory, it's a much more dynamic approach. It's what statisticians refer to as a stochastic process. When we talk about a stochastic process, if something is stochastic, it means that it is ever changing and it's very dynamic. So they view the existence of organizations from a stochastic lens in open systems theory, but from a much more static lens with classical organization theory. Since systems don't have this concrete existence, And since it is a dynamic stochastic process, what we need to do is we need to try and develop conceptual frameworks to help us to understand these changing phenomena. And that's what we try and do with the theories and the models that we are developing in a systems type of school of thought. Both natural systems theory, closed systems theory, and open systems theory are both predicated upon searching for a balance or an equilibrium. Both theories have as their ultimate goal this equilibrium, that once that equilibrium is struck, it will then enhance the chances of agency survival. So as these structural systems work toward this equilibrium, we know that that equilibrium, again, is dynamic. It's stochastic. It's very changing in nature. But organizations, despite working in this dynamic environment, are all striving to achieve this balance, this equilibrium, otherwise known in the literature as what is a point of homeostasis. So in systems theory, when you hear the word homeostasis used, it means the regulation of the structure and processes to adapt to an external environment. It's a steady state. It's a balance. So for your natural systems theorists, the point of homeostasis is the point at which all of the internal workings of the organization are in balance with each other. Essentially, what we would refer to today as organizational harmony. So if you think about an organization as a living organism, living organisms attempt to find that balance internally as well. Living organisms are considered to be healthy when they are devoid of disease. If you have a normal blood pressure, if you have normal pulse ox rate, if you have all your vital signs are normal, no temperature, no fever, then you are said to be at your steady state. You are in balance. All your inner workings are in balance with each other. And that's the goal, the point of homeostasis. That's the goal of natural systems theory. With open systems theory, that equilibrium, that balance is between the organization and its external environment. So for natural systems theorists, one of the primary natural systems theorists is Chester Barnard. And we run into Barnard a couple of different times in this course in the assigned readings. Barnard is important for natural systems theory because Barnard recognized that organizations existed as cooperative systems, that in order for an organization to be successful, its success was predicated on cooperation between the parts within the organization. So what organizations needed to do to be successful and to survive is they had to induce the members of the organization to provide contributions to contribute to achieving the ultimate goal of the organization, which is survival. So what the organization will do is it will compare the resources and the contributions that it is getting from employees to the incentives that need to be provided to those employees in order to induce those contributions. So it's a balance between providing incentives to employees that employees will value to motivate those employees to then provide these resources and these contributions toward the goals and objectives of the organization. So Barnard says it's kind of this transactional process that goes on between managers and employees in order to make organizations effective. You have to try and balance contributions that employees are giving with the incentives and the rewards that you are applying to those employees to motivate them to provide these contributions. An efficient organization, according to Barnard, is an organization in which the contributions that it extracts from its employees will exceed the net dissatisfaction of those employees. In other words, are you getting the contributions that you need in terms of productivity levels and effort levels from your employees that outweighs their dissatisfaction with having to give up those contributions. So you need to keep your employees satisfied so they'll be motivated to continue providing those contributions. How do you satisfy them? You satisfy them by providing the correct set of selective incentives that will motivate them to then provide those contributions. An effective organization is then defined as an organization's ability to achieve its goals. And again, here, the primary goal of any organization is going to be organizational survival. Barnard also cautions us that as we look for this balance between incentives that we give to employees and contributions that they give back to the organization, we also need to realize that each employee is different. And different employees will have different ethical standards and different sets of norms and values. So when we try to extract contributions from our employees, we need to do so mindful of those ethical standards and beliefs for each individual employee. This is what Barnard refers to as zones of indifference. It says every employee will have a different zone of indifference, pun intended. So everyone has a different zone of indifference. The zone of indifference is that area for each employee where if you ask them to do something that does not violate their ethical standards, chances are they will acquiesce and they will do what you are asking them to do. It is really only when you ask someone to do something that violates their ethics and violates their norms and values, that's when you get pushback from your employees. And that's what then messes up this transactional relationship between managers and their employees. So managers need to operate within the zone of indifference for each one of their employees, endeavor not to violate these ethical standards and these norms and values in order to continue getting the contributions from employees. Barnard argues that this transactional relationship is important for the success of the organization and for the survival of the organization. That organizations and leaders are only successful if they are able to extract the right set of contributions from their employees. If you can't get those contributions from your employees, you are not going to be successful as an organization. So Barnard is arguing we're looking for this balance in our organization. So how do we find this balance? Well, we find this balance, number one, through a system of communication. That probably sounds kind of familiar to like a Mary Parker Follett. We're looking for a system of communication. A system of communication so that we can learn what the zones of indifference are for each of our individual employees, so that we can learn what types of incentives we can provide our employees with in order to motivate them to provide contributions back to the organization. We achieve our transactional balance with our employees by inducing people to join in the organization and join in our attempts to try and achieve our goals and objectives and provide contributions for the achievement of those goals and objectives. Well, if we want people to contribute to organizational goals and objectives, then we better come up with very clear, well operationalized goals and objectives. So people know what those goals and objectives are to begin with, because if they don't know what the goals are and they don't have a clear view and definition of the goals, chances are they are not going to be able to provide the contributions in order to achieve those ill-defined goals. So Barnard tells us it's all about this compliance, it's all about this balance between managers and employees in order to get the contributions we need to achieve organizational goals. And the primary goal of the organization, again, because he's a natural systems theorist, is organizational survival. Barnard in natural systems theory had a lot of detractors, just like all of our other schools of thought. Now remember, new schools of thought in the history of public organization theory have risen as a result of criticisms of previous schools of thought. So if the previous school of thought didn't have any criticisms, chances are there would have been no need to develop a new theory or a new school of thought. So there are a lot of criticisms of Barnard and natural systems theory. The primary criticism is that it's relatively anti-democratic, in that natural systems theorists, and especially Barnard, will be looking to get contributions from employees primarily to benefit the organization. So critics argue that it really provided little justification for the social control of employees. And we were just exploiting employees to get the contributions and the effort from them that we need in order for us to achieve our organizational goals. So we were exploiting employees in order to get them to contribute to the goals of the organization without a whole lot of concern about the goals of the individual employees. Another criticism of Barnard is that it focused too much on the formal organization structure and didn't pay nearly enough attention to the informal aspects of organizations. Unlike Elton Mayo, who talked about informal groups and social structures, Barnard really paid too much attention to the formal aspects and not enough attention to the informal aspects of our organizations. So in perspective, when you look at Chester Barnard and natural systems theory, Barnard and natural systems theory emphasize all four of our models of organizational effectiveness. You can see some human relations there in terms of knowing your employees and communicating with your employees. There is certainly some internal process model there because you're looking for a balance into contributions and rewards on a daily basis in the processes being done by the organization and members of the organization. There's clearly a rational goal model because we are looking at the goal of the organization, which is agency survival, and to a little lesser degree, the open systems model. Now, the open systems model isn't nearly as prevalent here with Barnard and natural systems as we will see with Katz-Kahn and open systems theory, but there is still a recognition that organizations do operate within an environment, even though our primary focus is internal to the organization. Methods for coordination and control are primarily direct supervision. Again, we still have this top-down type of relationship between leaders and employees, and that leaders are trying to extract these contributions from employees and motivate them with selective incentives, and some standardization of values where possible. Because again, if you violate the values of employees, you're going to violate their zone of indifference, and you're not going to get the compliance and contribution that you need to be successful. In terms of our motivational strategies, primarily instrumental rewards and then goal congruence. Instrumental rewards, again, providing selective incentives to get the set of contributions that we need to benefit our organizational goals, and then trying to find some congruence between the goal of the organization and the individual. If the individual thinks that their goals are similar to the organization's goals, then they will work toward those organizational goals. So that's kind of the idea of natural or closed systems theory. Again, the focus really is on how to maintain a balance within the organization, and that balance really comes from a transactional process whereby leaders and managers get these contributions from employees by motivating them with providing selective incentives that those employees place a value upon. Before we get into open systems theory, though, there is an author by the name of Merton who provides us with what's referred to as his middle range theories that really kind of serves as a transition from the natural closed system to the open system approach. So it's not, just this abrupt change. It kind of gives us a gradual transition between the two. So in Merton's middle range theories, he took issue with the natural systems assumptions. He questioned this analogy of an organism, of an organization to a living organism. He said, we really can't say that organizations are like living organisms because they don't always behave like a living organism. We assume that a living organism will take steps and engage in activities that are essential for its survival. Organizations don't oftentimes do that. So not every activity that goes on within the organization is geared toward achieving the goal of agency survival. Not every activity that organizations engage in are indispensable for organizational survival. So what Merton really wants to do is kind of shift the goal of the organization away from survival. Let's stop looking at how the organization is trying to survive. And instead of looking at how the organization is trying to survive, let's shift our focus to the consequences of the organization. And the consequences that the organization and its goods and services that's providing, the consequences that those things are having on intended beneficiaries. So how is the organization impacting the public? How is the organization serving the wants, needs, and desires of its beneficiaries, of its consumers? Because Merton's functional theory will argue that a policy or a program, an approach, will remain in place as long as the net consequences of that policy or that program remain positive. So as long as it's producing positive consequences for beneficiaries, beneficiaries are going to continue to demand those policies and those programs. As they continue to demand those policies and those programs, that will then place pressure on elected officials and appropriators to provide the requisite resources that organizations need to continue providing those policies and those programs. So it's essentially a self-fulfilling type of prophecy. So let's focus on those beneficiaries and how well the organization serves its beneficiaries. The problem, according to Merton, is that sometimes organizations lose their way. And as organizations go through a maturation process, there's kind of a life cycle to public organizations. As public organizations mature and age, they tend to engage in this dysfunction that's known as overconformity. Overconformity is when organizations overconform to their rules, regulations, and procedures. And I think if you would ask just a member of the general public what they think about the bureaucracy and what's the major problem with the bureaucracy, I think that they would say red tape. They say organizations are too concerned with their rules and regulations as opposed to being concerned with serving the needs of their citizens. That's overconformity. That's what we refer to as goal displacement. The goal of the organization ceases to become serving citizens, and instead the goal of the organization becomes following rules and policies and regulations. And following those rules, that then becomes the ultimate goal of the organization. So they have engaged in goal displacement. That focus on rules and regulations also engenders a lot of rigidity. And as organizations go through their life cycle, they hit a point of what's called institutional rigidity, where because of all the rules and regulations and policies and procedures they have put in place over time, they become very rigid organizations. The more rigid they become, the more they build walls and barriers between the organization and members of the public. Once you have those walls and those barriers between the organization and members of the public then feels that they cannot communicate with the organization. It becomes just too daunting of a task to go to these organizations to try and get a redress of their grievances and to try and get the services that they need, which then creates conflict between the bureaucrats in the organization and the members of the public that those bureaucrats are supposed to serve. And I think, like Charles Goodsell tells us in his famous Case for Bureaucracy, one of the primary reasons why people have a negative view of bureaucratic organizations is because their last experience with that organization was a negative experience. Why was it a negative experience? Because of this rigidity, because of these barriers that the organization has set up between the organization and the citizens that organization is supposed to be serving. So the functionality of Merton is that he starts to shift us away from the natural systems approach of viewing organizations as living organisms. And he really questions that and says we really shouldn't look at them as living organisms, but instead we should focus on the consequences of the actions of those organizations, and specifically the consequences of the actions of the organization for those outside the organization, for those members of the external environment. So his utility is he's now forced us from an internal focus, like with natural systems theory, into an external focus with the rise of this thing called open systems theory. Open systems theory is a much more aggressive type of theory than natural systems theory. Open systems theory is really predicated upon the ability of the organization to adapt to changes in its environment. So now we're looking at how the organization is adapting to changes in that external environment. Another big difference between open systems and closed system or natural systems theory is that when natural systems theory looked at organizations as living organisms, they made the argument that living organisms, as they age and as they mature, will dissipate energy out into their external environment. They will lose energy and lose resources. So just like with any living creature, as that living creature ages, it loses energy. And it then becomes more subject to disease and things such as that. That's the natural life cycle that living organisms go through. And so natural systems theorists will say that's the natural progression that organizations go through as well. Open systems theorists will challenge that concept. So with a natural systems theorist, they will argue you dissipate energy, and your organization dissipates energy throughout its life cycle. That dissipation of energy out into the environment is a process known as entropy. So it's the decaying process for that living organism, for that organization. It's kind of a one-way street, that once entropy begins, entropy will continue until that organization no longer has the resources it needs to continue to survive. Open systems theorists argue that there is such a thing as negative entropy. So organizations don't always dissipate resources into the environment. Organizations can also import new energies and obtain new energies from their environments as well. New energy that organizations can import from their external environment can be things such as money and appropriations, can be political support from elected officials and from client groups, could be a labor pool, an adequate pool of labor to bring new people into the organization, new blood into the organization to help revive and reinvigorate the organization. So organizations just don't dissipate energy into the environment, but they also pull new energies back in to the organization. That's what's called negative entropy. That negative entropy means that, again, organizations don't just always decline and decay over time. They can reinvigorate themselves and go on and live on for an indefinite period of time. Both natural and open systems theory are predicated upon the idea of balance. For natural systems theory, it was the balance within the organization, the balance between the selective incentives you give employees and the contributions employees give back to the organization, but it's all internal. For open systems theorists, they're also focused on balance, but it's more of a balance between the organization and its external environment, making sure you achieve that point of homeostasis by balancing the organization with its environment. The important thing about open systems theory is that in achieving that balance between the organization and its environment, there are multiple paths, multiple different ways that organizations can achieve that balance. Different organizations will take different paths to achieve its balance with its external environment. That idea that there are multiple, numerous paths that you can follow to achieve your point of homeostasis, that's a term that's known as equifinality. Equifinality means multiple different ways to get to your steady state, to get to your point of homeostasis. But you can see with open systems theory, it is a much more aggressive type of model because it's looking beyond the walls of the organization, and it's not just asking, what do we do in terms of trying to find a balance within the organization, but now we're asking, how can we interact with our external environment? Realizing that, yes, the external environment is going to impact the organization. Some organizations operate in a very dynamic and very challenging environment. And sometimes they're in an environment that struggles to maintain the organization. But we also know that organizations can also then have an impact upon their environments and can leverage resources in the environment to obtain those resources, bring them into the organization, to then again help the organization survive and help the organization achieve its goals of serving its beneficiaries and its consumers. The two authors that are usually associated primarily with open systems theory are Katz and Kahn, and you're reading their article for this week. Katz and Kahn's approach to open systems theory really values, obviously, the open systems model of organizational effectiveness. It's a very flexible and also a very external type of focus to how we study organizations and how we measure the effectiveness of those organizations. When we look at what Katz and Kahn and open systems theory means for the mechanisms of control and the motivational factors, you don't see any of those boxes shaded in the Tompkins textbook because it can favor and it can value any of the mechanisms for coordination and control. It can also favor any of the motivational factors because it really does depend upon the organization. It depends upon the unique environment the organization finds itself in, and that path in equifinality, that path that the organization has chosen to try and achieve and maintain its balance with its external environment. Katz and Kahn in this open systems theory and this recognition that it really depends in terms of what mechanisms we use to control work and what motivational strategies we use has really led us to this theory known as structural contingency theory. And you can see some of the authors on the screen in the structural contingency school, people like Burns and Stalker and Woodward. But essentially what structural contingency theorists will argue is that we can build models to help us predict how changes in the environment will have an impact then on the management system within our organizations. Some environments have very frequent and very large changes that organizations have to deal with. Other environments are much more static and much more stable and don't really present the same types of challenges and issues for organizations. But essentially, just to boil structural contingency theory down, it is contextual. There is no one best way for us to organize the structure of our organizations or to organize the process of work in our organizations or the one best toolkit to give to our managers. That one best way approach begins to go away with structural contingency theory. And structural contingency theory really can emphasize any of these different models, any of these different mechanisms, because it depends upon the situation. We have to analyze the situation to understand how and why our organizations do what they do. Organizations and their structures and the way in which you manage organizations may be affected by a variety of different factors. Again, I've mentioned the first one, environmental uncertainty, how dynamic versus how stable your external environment is. Whenever a new administration comes into office, that introduces some uncertainty and some instability into the external environment. Technology, the type of technology the organization uses, will also have an impact upon how that organization structures itself and manages its operations. Here in the public sector, we tend to engage in a lot of what we call intensive technologies. Intensive technologies means that the way in which we deal with our consumers, our citizens, will differ depending upon the citizen that we are dealing with. So it's a very fluid, very changing type of technology. The size of the organization will also have an impact. We have some very large organizations with tens of thousands of employees. We have some very small commissions that only have 12 to 15 employees. The strategy of the organization will obviously make a difference for the activities of that organization and how that organization interacts with its environment. Resource dependency also has a big impact upon how we structure and manage our organizations in structural contingency theory. How dependent are we on appropriations? If we are dependent upon appropriations, then we need to please the appropriators. We need to demonstrate to the appropriators that we are worthwhile of continuing and hopefully enhancing appropriations in a future fiscal year. Some organizations are much less reliant upon appropriations, and they're more reliant upon things like donations. Nonprofit organizations can be very heavily dependent upon donations. So they need to appeal to their donors as opposed to appealing to elected officials. The strategies you use to appeal to donors for contributions will be a lot different than the strategies you use to appeal to an elected official. If you're dealing with an elected official, you're going to appeal to their re-election motives. And if they can see that providing additional appropriations for this organization will help their re-election prospects, then you're likely to get those additional appropriations. And public accountability. How accountable is the organization to the public? How tied is it to public scrutiny? Some of our organizations are very much tied to public scrutiny. Some of our organizations are a little bit more independent, and they don't have the same media scrutiny and elected official scrutiny that you would have in other organizations. I love the structural contingency approach, because the structural contingency approach really feeds into my favorite answer in all of my classes. Remember, in my classes, I have a favorite question, so what? And I have a favorite answer, it depends. Well, this really feeds into that it depends answer, because I think truly it does depend upon the organization, the environment it operates in, type of technology it uses, its size, its strategies, its resource dependence, its public accountability. Those are all factors that will have a direct impact upon the path that the organization chooses to achieve the balance that it needs to achieve with its external environment. So natural systems theory, Merton's middle range theories, and then Katz and Kahn open systems theory, all that forms this systems theory school of thought that I think is very useful for us in trying to understand our organizations and why they do what they do. Again, we're understanding it more through this lens of organizations do what they do to try and create this balance. For natural systems theorists, it's a balance to try and survive. For Merton and his middle range theories, it's more a balance in terms of the contributions it's contributing to its beneficiaries and how well it's serving its beneficiaries in terms of the consequences of the programs that it's delivering. For open systems theorists, it's really a focus on maintaining that balance between the organization and its external environment so it can continue to import those new energies and those new resources from the environment. So that's a quick overview of systems theory. Again, it really kind of changes our focus from the classical school and from human relations school in terms of how we go about studying our organizations. Okay, now that we have talked about the main topics for this week in terms of systems theory, now we can turn our attention very briefly to the primary assignment that you'll be doing this week. And so the primary assignment for week number 4 in this course is another one of those discussion board assignments, this one obviously on systems theory. So prepare for this assignment. You'll read all the assigned chapters in the classics book, read the posted videos, and we have several videos available for you this week, just kind of as supplemental viewing, and then also read the chapters in the Tompkins textbook. After you've done all the reading and read all the videos, then you're ready to do your discussion board. For this discussion board, we're asking that you locate a minimum of 1 academic peer-reviewed journal article that builds on each of the concepts covered in this week's readings, including those by Chester Barnard, by Robert Merton, and by Katz and Kahn, the three main authors that we talked about so far in the recorded lecture for this week. So in other words, you're going to pick one article from each chapter for a minimum of 3 articles. So 3 articles, 1 article on each of those individual theorists. Consider exploring articles that may relate to your task force. So for example, open systems theory in healthcare or manifest functions in first responder agencies, but you're going to be linking this then up to the task force that you are recommending the creation of. Think broadly about your research. So each chapter in the Topkin text, along with the videos this week, should incorporate multiple theories and concepts from the classical, HR, and neoclassical periods. Feel free to explore your journal article research in any direction that is of interest to you. Just be sure to explain how it fits the concepts covered in chapters 9 through 11. Combine several sources, those articles, 3 articles that you have selected, the articles out of Shafritz, the chapters from the Tompkins textbook, and the videos made available to you, and the several theorists together to form a discussion on each topic. Each topic should have several theories or theorists woven together in the discussion. So you'll be talking about natural systems theory, you'll be talking about middle range theories, you'll be talking about open systems theory, and how those will contribute to the task force that you are planning on creating. So if you've got a task force that you think is going to be operating in a very fluid, very dynamic environment, then open systems theory will obviously be a major portion of what you are preparing then for this discussion board. As always, and you're used to this now, you'll develop a PowerPoint presentation. When you develop your PowerPoint presentation, you'll discuss the 3 concepts that you researched and provide information you drew from the several sources to provide your insights in the topic. Provide page numbers and or paragraphs where you found the information, just so we're able to go back and cross-reference that information that you are providing. Provide a brief example of how each concept could impact your proposed task force. Again, your narrative presentation should be less than 5 minutes. You have a minimum of 4 slides. You'll create and embed the narrated presentation, and then as always, you'll respond to 2 of your classmates. So it's a pretty light week in terms of that's your only assignment is this week 4 discussion board on systems theory. So I hope this video was helpful for you in kind of working your way through the different theories for this week. And I look forward to reading your discussion board post. And if you have any questions, as always, please feel free to send me an email. I'm happy to answer any questions. Otherwise, I hope everyone has a great week 4.